Hello, and welcome to today's conversation. How is tech setting and measuring its climate goals? I'm Bennett Richardson, president of Protocol. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our partners at Emex for making today's event possible. At Protocol, we aim to arm you as decision makers in technology, business, and policy with actionable news and analysis to help you do your job. Climate goals, net zero, carbon offsets, scope 3 emissions, these are just some of the terms you'll find in big tech's climate plans. Understanding what they actually mean is vital to ensuring the industry is meeting its goals and understanding whether those goals are the right ones. We'll talk with some of the people responsible for setting those goals and experts who are monitoring them to find out what tech companies are really doing. We're so glad you could tune in today. If you're not already subscribed, don't forget to sign up for Protocol Climate and Protocol's entire family of newsletters at protocol.com/newsletters. To kick things off, I'm excited to introduce Daniel Gribbin for an executive conversation on the complexity of climate reporting and how organizations are measuring it. Daniel is the VP of Sustainability and ESG at Emex Software. He recently joined Emex after 12 years in consulting with KPMG and WSP. He helps businesses across the globe navigate their individual regions and align their practices with their government's requirements and increasing shareholder demand for better ESG information. Welcome, Daniel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bennett. Great to be here.
Would love your help setting the stage for the conversation today. Let's take it from the top. How are companies setting and measuring their climate goals? What sort of technologies and solutions are companies using to manage these issues?
Yeah, look, it's a really great question. At the moment, it's a really diverse range of solutions that companies are providing. We are seeing the extreme of very manual processes of companies collecting raw data, invoices, activity data, and manually calculating that, which is an extremely cumbersome sort of human-based activity, through to systems who are adopting platforms like Emex's, where we're automating data and we're trying to provide a platform-wide solution so that companies can get an answer and actually use data rather than spend time collecting data, which is at the end of the day where we want to be. We want to have automation in process so that we can use data in a manner to set the targets and actually have a meaningful impact, which is the big thing for us. So do we have the right carbon measurement? Do we have the right tools? Do we have the right automation so that we can set those net zero targets? We can set those carbon neutral targets, and we can actually reduce our scope 1, 2, 3 emissions in an appropriate manner rather than worrying about the data collection side. So what we would like to see and what the market is slowly shifting towards in the way that financial markets did hundreds of years ago is towards that automation. What we're starting to see is that happening at speed and at pace, and lots of players in the market around the digitization world. And things that are coming to the fore at the moment are things like IoT devices, instantaneous data uploads, so that you can get real-time data on an app or on a phone. You can see how your product's performing from an embedded carbon perspective, and actually start to make that meaningful, tangible change as a business.
Yeah, that real-time feedback clearly really important about making those decisions. Wanted to pick up on one thing you mentioned. You can't talk about climate reporting today without talking about scope 3 emissions. Reporting on scope 3 emissions continues to be under a bit of a microscope. Would love your thoughts there. Should we be focusing on making scope 3 reporting easier? Are there other climate reporting priorities that we should be focusing on instead?
Yeah, look, it's a controversial one for me. Scope 3, as far as I'm looking at, is someone else's scope 1 or 2. And what we're using scope 3 for at the moment is a sledgehammer to try and drive change into an industry and to accelerate the way that we report on climate change. So we're using scope 3 as large organizations, as industry, as tech giants to force our smaller players to start to measure their footprint, to start to improve their processes, and to create that behavior change. But we're creating that behavior change in their scope 1 or 2 emissions. So what we probably see at Emex here is over a life cycle of, as we get more mature in our carbon reporting phase, scope 3 will probably go away over the next 5 to 10 years, and it will become scope 1 and 2, because at the moment there is some double counting that is going on. But we need to have that regulatory change. We need to drive change in a world where climate demand and disclosure is so high. So it's being used as that sledgehammer at the moment to really hold home that sort of that messaging that you need to measure your footprint, you need to make sure it's a robust footprint, and that the scope 3 emissions are part of your responsibility, even though they might be up or down your value chain there. So in terms of sort of the challenges there, what we're seeing is you are asking smaller companies to start to measure their footprint. You're asking a input provider to understand the embedded carbon of a small piece of copper or a piece of plastic that goes into a product. And for that might be a 10, 20 person company. And that is quite a challenge for them to get their head around. How do I measure that footprint? How do I understand the embedded carbon of that? What am I electricity, natural gas, scope 1 and 2 emissions that are going into that, so that we as the upstream or downstream provider can actually use that in our scope 3. So there's the big challenge at the moment. We have a gap in knowledge and a gap in ability of some of the size of these companies to be able to measure an accurate footprint. And then we have to, of course, make it easier for these people. So are we able to apply some sort of predetermined proxies in our value chain so that we can perhaps make it easier for them to use a widget of plastic and understand what that carbon implication is, so that we can easily report up and downstream. And it's something that I know that the regulators are looking at, and why we're getting asked more about scope 3 emissions, because if we have a more robust inventory, we're able to make decisions around that in a much more easier and straightforward manner.
Well, thank you. And I want to pick up on something you mentioned there. Obviously, regulatory change can have a big impact in areas like that. Between the SEC's climate proposal last month here in the States, and even new greenwashing fines happening in Australia over the past few days, regulators are continuing to focus more on climate reporting as a policy priority. What does that all mean? And curious how it's impacting Emex's business.
Yeah, I mean, what it means is that changes come. The last decade since I've been doing this, it's been a slow tidal wave. It's been increasing pressure. There has been probably a 5 to 10% of companies who wanted to be seen as good Samaritans and have a good CSR value who have been reporting on climate change, as well as other metrics, social impact, etc., diversity. But what is happening now is regulators are taking this in their hands. So the SEC announcement was a big one to 4,000 of the biggest companies in the US, that they need to start to report on carbon, and not just scope 1 and 2, but on scope 3, and also mainly on impact. We're seeing Europe start to mandate the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So starting to link climate change to financial performance. And what this is just, it's a major signal to the market that you need to adapt to your business, and you need to change the way that you are operating and how you are measuring the performance of your company. What we've seen in Australia lately is, companies start to get fined for greenwashing, as you said. And that is a major impact of where we're coming full cycle in the regulatory world, of not just having a nice to have reporting system where we get an inventory and we get a carbon baseline, but also holding companies accountable, not just leaving it to activists and to others to hold companies as that accountable, but actually as a regulatory environment, holding them accountable to how they measure, how they perform, and the robustness of the information that they are making available to the market.
Well, that's great, and important to get ahead of that now before a regulator catches up with you for not complying with some of those regulatory standards in the reporting. Thank you, Daniel. Super insightful insights to kick things off here. And thanks again to Emex for the partnership.
Thank you, Bennett.
Now we'll move on to our panel. I'm excited to bring up Brian Kahn, Protocol Climate Editor, to introduce our speakers and moderate today's event. Brian, over to you.
Bennett, thank you so much for hosting that fireside chat and for the warm introduction. To everyone watching, my name is Brian Kahn. I'm the Climate Editor at Protocol, and I'm really happy to be here today for a variety of reasons. For one, we are a little more than a month removed from the launch of Protocol's climate section, so I'm really happy to have some excellent panelists, as well as everyone on the live stream joining us for that 1 month launch. I guess 1 month and change anniversary, and also a big thanks to everyone for being here for what is our first Protocol climate event. Today, the issues we're talking about are so important because of the context in the world we live in right now. We just had a major United Nations climate report drop earlier this month, showing us that we have really waited a bit too long for action, and now we have a lot of work to do. That's the bad news, but the good news is that we also have the tools available to do that work. When I say we, I mean everyone. We're all going to be involved in this. And so what I'm excited to do today is talk with folks that are working at companies at the corporate level to make solutions happen at their corporations, but also how we can work together to make sure we're scaling those things and making sure that innovation reaches every corner of the globe so that we hit that crucial net zero target by 2050. I'm excited to dive into today's discussion. I will introduce our panelists in brief here, and then we'll hop right in. Today, I'm really lucky to be joined by Faith Taylor, who's the Global Sustainability Officer at Kyndryl. We also have Shamina Singh. She's the Executive Vice President of Sustainability at Mastercard. We have Suzanne DiBianca, who's the Chief Impact Officer at Salesforce, and then Jamie Beck Alexander, who's the Director of Drawdown Labs. That's a part of Project Drawdown, and Jamie is focused on helping corporations scale climate solutions together. Thank you to all my guests for being here today. And I want to start today by talking to our sustainability officer experts. I want to dive into maybe a hard question to start with, which is I'm really curious to hear from you. what are some of the challenges that you face when it comes to measuring your emissions across your value chain? And I guess, Suzanne, since you're, with the big data company here, I'm going to turn it to you. And I don't know, hopefully maybe you figured this all out. But I'd be curious to hear what you're working on and what the challenges are.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Brian, for having me here and for just all the excellent work that Protocol has done to shine a light on all of these issues and be provocative and really talk about the important things. So just a lot of gratitude. Nice to be here with some of my friends that I haven't seen for a while. And I'll just start by saying, Salesforce is focused really on 3 priorities. One is achieving net zero now. We accelerated our commitment just a few years ago. We're, as of this year, totally net zero across our entire value chain, scope 1, 2, and 3. We also hit our goal of being powered by 100% renewable energy. So we think a lot about operational excellence, acceleration, and then we think a lot about net zero as terms of how we can help our customers get there as well. So we built a product this year. We have the privilege of working with Mastercard and others, but we think that's really our superpower, to your point, Brian, around data. Insight management is really, what we're thinking about in terms of net zero now. The second thing is around 1 trillion trees. This is something we're really passionate about. We really believe in the reduction of emissions, having a science-based target, and for things that we can't reduce, high quality offsets is really important. We're very focused on nature-based solutions as a way to get there. Again, with our partners, Mastercard and many of others that are on the call. But what we love about nature-based solution and 1trilliontrees.org is that, it's so much more than just carbon sequestration. That's critical. Conservation is critical, but it also provides biodiversity, economic development, et cetera. And then lastly, we think a lot about ecopreneurs, this revolution of young innovators in the for-profit and not-for-profit sector, and how can we best get behind them? So we do that with an investment fund off our balance sheet and the ventures portfolio and through our philanthropic assets, and just did a $100 million climate justice fund that we're really excited about. So those are sort of our priorities and how we're thinking about taking the climate challenge head on.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of things already figured out, which I'm glad to hear. I'd love to turn over to Shamina. Would you tell us a little bit about MasterCard, maybe some of the challenges with when it comes to accounting for your emissions as well, and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. And, thank you so much for having me here. We do a lot of work with Suzanne and Salesforce, and happy to talk about, that partnership during the course of this conversation. But I think what's interesting, a lot of what Suzanne mentioned, of course, is a lot of what, we're thinking about, which is, our own footprint first, and then how we think about our other supply chain opportunities. And like many tech companies, which I think is why it's so great that you're hosting this panel today, we may not necessarily have a huge footprint, but what we do have is an ability to work across our network, which includes 3 billion cardholders and 20,000 network partners like banks, and millions of other opportunities where we can sort of help influence the conversation around climate action. And I think that's really unique to, our piece. I mean, the things that Suzanne talked about, as far as I'm concerned, those are table stakes now. You got to do those things, and they're going to get regulated, and that's all coming, and we can talk a lot about that. But I think the piece that's really interesting for us and for us to think about with other tech companies is what's unique about our value in terms of how we can contribute. And I like how Suzanne mentioned eco-entrepreneurs. I think for Mastercard, we've been leading the payment space around SBTI and all of those other things. But at the same time, we've been focused on ESG. And even today, we just announced that we are linking an ESG modifier to all of our compensation for every employee at Mastercard. So we're really trying now to embed ESG standards into the heart of our company. And one way to do that, in addition to taking care of our own business, is to ensure that our employees have it built into their compensation.
And Faith, I'm curious to turn over to you. I mean, Kyndryl is a relatively new independent company, and so where are you at in this process?
So we're at the beginning of this process. We spun off from IBM, 90,000 people and 19 billion in sales. So we're one of the biggest startups. So, but the way that we're building it is absolutely focused on what we call the table stakes, net zero, science-based target initiatives, and including scope 1, 2, and 3. But I do really want to talk about scope 3 because you talked about the challenges. Scope 3 for every company is a major challenge. And if you really look at, and there's been quite a bit of analysis on it in terms of purchased goods and services and how we're accounting for that within all industries, is still what I would say a lot of work to be done. And I think my peers would agree with that. And how do you avoid double counting? How do you actually understand where the carbon emissions are occurring upstream and downstream? And how do we properly account for that so that we can reduce our footprint? And if you look at all major industries, scope 3 is the largest. So I think that's our opportunity as we're building our program to really develop solutions and enable us to have that happen.
And I would love to bring in Jamie to this discussion here, Jamie, because your goal is to help folks collaborate across these companies. And so I'm really curious. I mean, when it comes to thinking about scope 3, which inherently brings in various parts of the value chain, are there ways for these companies to collaborate to ensure that they're focusing on driving down emissions, both in-house and potentially down or upstream, as the case may be?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Well, it's I don't claim to be a tech expert or an expert in the sector at all. You all are the deep, doing the deep work. We luckily, at Project Drawdown, we're sort of focused on the atmospheric perspective. So, what does the atmosphere feel? What does the atmosphere need? At what point can we actually achieve drawdown, which is when our greenhouse gases start to decline in the atmosphere? And by that metric, collaboration between companies is one of the biggest things we need to do, because any one company cannot solve this on their own. We need, and companies need to be looking at, in addition to, I love how Shamina framed it, your own footprint, then your supply chain, kind of your network, and then as Suzanne mentioned, your superpower. And I think we also look at how companies can collaborate and aggregate their voices around climate policy issues when it matters. I know you all are doing a lot on that, and Salesforce has really been leading in this area. But also looking at what are your products out there doing in the world? How can tech companies kind of band together and say, okay, at some point we need to sort of stop selling into the fossil fuel sector or start to shift our products toward climate solutions. So I think there's value in. There's strength in numbers when companies come together, especially across a sector, to say, no, in order to meet this crisis at the magnitude that it warrants, we need to come together and send a strong message using our aggregated clout, resources, influence, and financial power. So I think that, and we see a lot of that when companies come together to use their aggregated voice to help change things.
Let's come back to that in 1 second, but I do want to think about the company level for just 1 second. And I know that, Shamina, you just mentioned that your compensation is now tied to ESG goals. And I know Salesforce has similar, compensation structures as well. And so I'm wondering if I can hear from each of you, I'm curious, how do you ensure that people are pulling in that same direction and that, these ESG goals, that this net zero target that you're working towards is just as important as the bottom line? Because I know that, at the end of the day, you're there to make at least some money for some folks, but how do you make sure that we also have a habitable planet to spend it on? So I'm really curious to hear how you make sure those things stay aligned.
Yeah, so I think it's to pardon the pun, but it's not a net zero sum game. I think it is these things, at least at Mastercard, and I think I would argue for many other companies, employees are actually clamoring for this, right? So in an environment where we're fighting for all the brains and and all the talent out there, I think that working on these issues is a real recruitment and retention strategy. And so for us to really align on the compensation side for all of the employees at Mastercard, I think employees really welcome it, because I think this is a way that they also understand and feel committed, and understand that we're also committed to making sure that when we go out with pronouncements, not only around climate action, but around social impact action, like financial inclusion in our case, that we're really serious about it and we don't take it lightly. And so I would sort of say that not only for climate activity, but also for our social impact activity, we have aligned the business strategy with our social impact and our environmental impact strategy, so that it really isn't something that is mutually exclusive for us. And maybe it's because we're a payments company and we have a network around the world that we're able to do that. But I do think that there are these ways that companies can find the win-win. And for us, that's really been about managing near-term horizon with long-term horizon. And if you have a long-term view of your business and for the planet and for everybody else, I think that that's how you get to a place where you can align your business strategy with your ESG goals.
Suzanne, do you want to hop in? I'm really curious.
Yeah, I think it's a really smart question. I mean, you can't manage what you're not measuring. And so, and I loved, hearing earlier about, the very interesting work that's being led in the US by the SEC on regulation. I think one of the challenges is standards, having consistent standards, actually from a global perspective. And so, and I would underline also Faith's point about supply chain. I think that, both of these things require measurement in order to manage them well. So, the two, for example, things that we use at Salesforce as it relates to executive compensation and climate are two things. Both of it are challenges, but really powerful. And, because we have the privilege of being a software company, and we can build dashboards and send them out, which is what we do on a regular basis through our Net Zero Cloud product, is around 50% reduction in absolute travel emissions from a baseline before the pandemic. And now the world is opening back up a bit and everybody wants to go somewhere. And so we have to be really diligent, and we have to make sure that we're sending all department heads like how they're doing against these travel emission reduction goals. This is a particularly tough time in which to do that, as people are kind of feeling, I think, a little bit pent up, wanting to get out in the world. But we know we can work with our customers and do what we're doing today in a virtual way. So just being really clear on what the metrics are and how people are doing against them. And the second thing, just related to suppliers, is, we submitted, that's the other thing we pay people against, which is what percentage of the people that they're signing contracts with have signed our supplier exhibit. So we've said it, we had an exhibit, you can find it on our website, anybody can use it, that essentially gave 3-year runway. We did it last year, so 2 years remaining, to set a science-based target, or Salesforce won't contractually do business with you anymore. So, we know that in order to have the impact that we want to have over time, that we have to meet our science-based target, we need to be really rigorous around the management and the measurement of that data.
How important, I'm curious, with the science-based target, so for folks that may not be aware, it's an initiative that is voluntary and it helps companies sort of set and track goals. I mean, how important is it to have that sort of, at least, it's not mandatory, but how important is it to have an outside source to sort of vet this and give guidance to maybe those folks further down the supply chain that don't have the resources of a Salesforce or a Mastercard or a Kyndryl?
I believe that third-party validation is good. And if you want to have comparable metrics, how else can you do it unless you have a third party looking at your data in an industry? Because everybody can report in terms of the scope 1, 2, and 3. There are certain guidelines, but there is some flexibility of what you report, timing, boundaries. So it's the only way to really get what I call comparable data. But in terms of having some kind of validation, and not only science-based target, but having assurance, right, by a third party. So whether it's a big accounting firm who goes through and gives you, it's not an audit, but it's called assurance, And you can do pre-assurance, and you can do different levels for your carbon, water, waste, even your social metrics. And that also gives you some comfort that there's a third party that's looking at how you're developing your data, the integrity of it, the assumptions that you're using. And so I believe that we're going to have some kind of standardization around this. And this is where the difficult part comes in. And I agree with Susan that you have all these countries regulating, whether it's in Europe, whether it's at the SEC. A lot of them are using TCFD as the framework, which is to assess climate risk. But at the end of the day, we need to see some kind of harmonization of these different frameworks so that we can report in a way that's meaningful for the industry. And more importantly, meaningful in terms of, are we actually reducing our carbon emissions? So that's where I look at it from that standpoint. But it's a journey because not everyone are able to do all of that at once. And so you have to figure out how you can do it in phases.
I'm curious, are any of you, I know we've talked a little bit about, it sounds like at least a few of you talk to each other. Hopefully all three of you are just sharing great ideas, or will be after this. But in terms of thinking about that idea of harmonization across jurisdictions, are you in discussions with other companies or with governments to figure out how we are ensuring that, it's not ESG goals like one way in Europe, one way in the US, one way in China? Are you working to sort of figure out ways to harmonize across jurisdictions and working together to do that at all?
Well, I'll just give a couple examples that might be helpful to the people listening as well, and particularly to your point, Brian, around the small to medium-sized companies that may not have the similar resources that a Mastercard and a Salesforce might, which is there are all kinds of really interesting buyers alliances that are happening. There's something called REBA, which we helped found, which is the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. There is something that we've just put together called Basics, which is relative to some of the carbon programs that we're doing with blue carbon, for example. We're actually just last week announced an effort with a number of NGOs to create some more standardization on what does a blue carbon high quality credit look like over time. We've joined something called the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Alliance, which is a selection called SABA, the Buyers Alliance that basically pools resources to accelerate clean fuel technologies in the aviation sector. So I think you can, especially for smaller companies, but even for big companies, getting involved in some of these collaboratives really creates the demand signal that we need from this sector to sort of move faster, whether it's with renewable or blue carbon or, sustainable aviation. But, those are things that regardless of your size, that you can engage with peers. And, we've learned so much from our peers as it relates to this.
I think the other thing, just real quick, is that there is something called the Sme Climate Hub. And so that's one that we have also joined. And because I think it's a great point that, this conversation, I think it's sort of like has even been an evolution, right? I sort of feel like this is ESG for the rest of us. In terms of, technology companies that may or may not have a huge footprint, this notion of making sure that we're not leaving people or small businesses behind in the supply chain, I think is equally important. And so collectives like the SME Impact Hub that allow for standardized tools, reduce the cost of data aggregation and data harmonization, are all the types of things that companies like Mastercard and others have to do in order to ensure that if you're a sole proprietor or you're a thousands of people company, that you have some way to engage and participate in climate action. The other thing to think about is even with the small businesses and all with the investments, we're seeing enormous interest, obviously, in creating businesses in this space, and obviously for impact investing and the types of things that Suzanne described. I would also sort of that one of the things to think about is the data piece, right? So for us, and as a payment company, we can think about how do we help customers and consumers understand their own emissions what are they doing in their day to day? We have something called a carbon calculator that we launched with one of our partners called Economy that allows consumers to look at their payment history, their payment behavior, and understand where they're spending their dollars and how that impacts the environment. And so at least at this stage, equipping consumers with the information they need to make decisions about how they spend, I think is a way, again, that not only is there a business proposition there, but there's also a way for companies, again, to use their superpowers to get involved in the conversation.
Is there any concern with that, about that calculator? One of the common things that's at least referring in the climate community is this idea, the carbon footprint was this term popularized by BP and offloading the need for collective action onto the individuals. And I'm wondering how you kind of see that as a role as a large company with a lot of influence both on individuals and throughout, various payment processors throughout the world. How do you kind of, I guess, draw that line to say we want to help individuals versus we don't want to offload this entire problem and all the solutions onto people themselves?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's why it comes back to, are we walking the walk ourselves? And so being able to make sure that, whether it's travel or whether it's our own footprint or our scope 1, 2, and 3, emissions, that we're doing the work that we have to do and everything we can do as a company, leveraging our network and our partnerships to ensure that we have it, we're sort of operating at maximum capacity is really important when you're trying to ensure that you're using your technology and your product set to also inform or help customers make decisions about their own carbon footprint.
And Shamina, I actually want to come to you a little bit on this as well. I mean, I know that when it comes to scaling up actions and making sure that companies are working together, there was an interesting piece that came out in Reveal recently about an ad that Drawdown Labs wanted to run, and we didn't have a few of your members of Drawdown Labs didn't want to sign on, and they just didn't sign on for whatever reason. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that and sort of what that tells you in terms of being able to gauge how serious companies are about climate action versus how serious they may be about press releases, and how we kind of maybe move, tip that scale a bit so that we're being really serious about the actions and having collective solutions.
Thanks for that question, Brian. That was just a piece came out a few weeks ago that Brian's referencing, where we had asked a bunch of our business partners to support, essentially support the Build Back Better Act or the climate provisions in the Build Back Better Act. Several of our larger partners didn't sign on for, myriad different reasons. And a reporter, kind of looked into it and wrote a story about it. So I think this is a difficult question, Brian.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you totally on the spot. Maybe I did.
No, it's a good one. I mean, I think it is, one specific ad in the New York Times, one specific sign-on letter is not a barometer for any one company's climate ambition. And that is, that's totally clear. Companies can support climate policy in a lot of different ways through, behind the scenes engagement with legislators, or, through their trade associations, or through, sign-on letters, things like that. So I don't take a lot out of that one specific experience of one New York Times ad. However, I have been working in this space for a really long time, essentially like pleading, begging, making the business case for companies to support climate policy. I've been doing it for a long time. And it's like, and I think on some level, I think I can make some generalizations about how, how hard it is to get, to have companies like put their policy clout where their sustainability commitments are. And that's relevant to, whether they sign on to sign-on letters, whether they're working inside their trade associations to change things like the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable. Are they supporting, are they supporting political candidates who are opposing climate action? I think there are a lot of different ways that companies can step in on climate policy, and I don't really think we've begun to scratch the surface of what's possible. And right now, it really, really matters. There's really, really important climate policy on the line. And I think what we're seeing is sort of like, that we're seeing like what's worked in the past, which was like sign-on letters or, these sort of like general statements that companies support climate policy, when what we need right now, based on what is everything that's on the line when it comes to life as we know it on planet Earth, I think we need some new strategies, some new tactics, some new and bolder ways of companies kind of saying, no, we really mean it. And then we're going to show it by stepping up on this, on every federal policy that comes up around climate action, and take all these other steps that I mentioned. I think there's a lot happening in this space right now, and it's a big moment of shift. And I know, Suzanne, you've been leading in this area, and Salesforce has been leading in this area for a while now.
Yeah, I'd love to actually, along those lines, Jamie mentioned the business roundtable, and I know that all three members of our Stanley officers here your companies are members of the business roundtable, which initially opposed Build Back Better. They've softened their stance a little bit, but today just came out with a roadmap for U.S. energy policy that calls for more pipelines, liquid natural gas, and oil and gas construction, which is one of those things where it doesn't quite align with what we think of when we think of what the IPCC is telling us we need to do. And so I'm wondering how you see your role as the sort of voices of sustainability reason inside your company, and the fact that, sure, there are ways where the business roundtable's interests align with the things that you want to do. How do you deal with that sort of balance of trying to say, we need to have our sustainability goals, we need this climate policy, versus, maybe this group is not advocating exactly for what we want right now?
Well, maybe I'll just jump in quickly. I think, we follow the lead of people like Jamie and Drawdown and Suzanne, and just the incredible industry groups that, however we can get behind with our sort of corporate prowess to do that. I think that, every company needs to make its own decision. They need to focus on their own operations before sort of going more broadly to criticize other sectors. So, I think that, listen, we have to get the world to net zero. We have no other option. And so we have to come together to do that, whatever industry we're in, hard to abate industries or otherwise. I'm seeing so much more progress than I was just 12 months ago, and that gives me a lot of hope. And I know that there is still controversy out there. I know the fossil fuel industry is very tricky as it relates to both investment and transition. That said, I think that we can all do, what we can do to Shamina's point with our consumers. What I love is, I go on and look for a flight on Google now, and I see my emissions right next to price. I get a statement from Mastercard. I see what every purchase costs me in emissions. So I think that even just shining the light on it from a consumer point of view, from a company point of view, enables action that wasn't possible. So I guess I just want to say that, I think that we have to do what's in our control. We have to use our superpower as best we can. We have to get behind the best NGOs in this space, like Drawdown, and really just bring our heft and not be too proselytizing, if that's even a word, as we kind of move forward in our own efforts. So I don't know if that directly answered your question, but I just think it's really important to have a balanced view and to do what you can and point your superpower to impact.
And I'm also glad you brought up IPCC, because I think the last report that the one that came out, they finally included a chapter on, I think, something really important. And this is sort of like the people and, how the connection between income inequality and environmental impact, with everything going on right now with, refugees, the impact of climate on refugee populations is enormous. And so if we're not thinking about the impact of income on people, and especially on women who are much more likely to be displaced, much more likely to be impacted by climate initiatives, thinking about farmers, especially small shareholder farmers, the majority of whom are women, and really making this link between income and financial inclusion for us and inclusive growth and sustainability, I think we're really missing the boat. And So I was really delighted to see that IPCC, they've included language, would love to see much more activity in the space, would love to encourage much more activity in the space. But I think that's an enormous a piece of the work that we've been missing. And I don't know if that helps Jamie in terms of the advocacy, but it's certainly a place that when we have talked to our employees, our customers, our stakeholders, making this link between economic inclusion and environmental inclusion is a really important link that seems to have some resonance. So I don't know if others are hearing that or have an opinion about that, but that's certainly something we're seeing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that what's going to be tough, and that I think, Jamie, I really respect Drawdown and all the work that your group is doing, because it's basically saying we have the solutions today. Why aren't we just moving forward with it? I think is the message. At the end of the day, I know that we're going through a transition process, but how long do we have to go through this transition, I think is the point. And I think one of the things that I think that we're really not dealing with is how we're going to adapt to this increasing climate change. That as we continue to see, flooding, wildfires, increasing, like you were saying, refugees, migrant, climate change refugees. We're going to be dealing with that at the same time as we're trying to implement solutions. And so to me, that's the sobering part of this, because our companies still have to be sustainable and profitable at the same time as we're trying to adapt, at the same time as we're trying to solve for it. I think that, and so when I look at, the road ahead, how do we manage that on a global basis? Because, that's the reality of what we're going through. And I really am appreciative of the IPCC report and trying to have a sense of urgency. But, I think the timing is the thing that's really the challenge and what we're trying to do in this time frame. So how do we accelerate it? And I don't have an easy answer. I'm not going to sit here and act like I'm an expert on that. But I really think that adaptation piece at the same time as trying to solve for it is really one of our biggest challenges.
Can I just jump in quick, Brian?
Yes, please.
I think that's exactly the right question, Faith. How do we accelerate the solutions that we already have today in a way that, kind of meets the urgency of the moment and displaces the things that we were doing in the past that are no longer compatible with the future we need to move toward. So at Project Drawdown, we've identified what we call accelerators, and these are scaling tactics. So how do we take these, climate solutions and scale them in the world quickly to avert the worst, the worst impacts of climate change? And some of those accelerators are policy, climate policy that will enable all of society, that will enable all of your users to be able to, use Salesforce with renewable energy. We need policy in place to enable more people to be able to, have renewable energy. So it's, policy is a scaling tactic. Investment, we need massive investment in climate solutions and shifting it away from essentially fossil fuels and the other contributors to climate change. It, of course, aggregated individual action. We need people employed. So we're looking at, what are those big scaling tactics? And again, to bring it back to policy, since that's so top of mind in the US right now, we need climate policy in place to enable all of your company, all of these companies to be able to accelerate and meet your climate targets. So that's really a focus of ours right now, because speed is the most important thing, the most important factor.
I think that's it's a great segue, Jamie, because I was curious. I know that Salesforce did come out and support the Build Back Better Act, which I think would have, it's dead for now, but it would have gotten us, on the right track, right? It would have sped up the process, right, as Jamie was saying. And I'm wondering, can we expect to see any of your companies come out in support of more holistic climate legislation? Because at the end of the day, no one company is going to solve this all. And I think we're all aware of that and the challenges you face, but getting those policies in place are what are going to help not just each of your companies, but society get on the right track. And so I'm curious, where do you see your role as companies in pushing for those kinds of policies that we do need?
Well, I'll just quickly say that it's both federal and local. I think Jamie's right. Policy is a critical lever. We did come out in support of that. We've also come out pretty aggressively in support of climate disclosures. So is Apple, so some other really leading tech companies. So that said, there's also really important things you can do. I think cities are moving much faster than the federal government is right now. So there's been great legislation, for example, where I live in California on electric vehicles, basically banned 2030. And so there's things we can do we were supportive of that legislation. We were, and there's been really some interesting things, for example, happening in India as it relates to conservation. Same is true in Australia and Canada. So, we look at where do we have leverage and footprint. We have big offices in all those places I just mentioned. We look at, what's happening from a federal perspective. How can we sort of put our hand up and bring our lobbying power as we can to those important climate issues. But also, often, even more importantly, is what can we do at the city and state level to really accelerate policy. And I'm really excited what I'm seeing at the city level in particular.
Yeah, I think there's some really fascinating things going on there. Just had a chance to go to let's hear from some folks in the class I teach, from the LA's Chief Sustainability Officer, as well as someone who did a similar role in New York, and a lot of fascinating stuff happening at the city level. So I agree, and I'm also intrigued to see what those laboratories of democracy turn up for us, solutions-wise. I'd be curious. Shamina or Faith, are there policy levers that you see either Mastercard or Kyndryl wanting to pull on either at the federal, the state, the international level as far as accelerating action on climate?
I can jump in here. I think that it may not specifically relate in the way that Jamie is describing, but one of the things that we're really involved in is this notion of digitization of activity. And so to the extent that if we can move from an analog world to a digital world, which is sort of already happening, that in and of itself has, at least that we have found, makes an enormous difference in the climate strategy. So for example, we're in the payment space, and so we have done the analysis to show how much it costs to produce cash, and cash is an enormous climate killer. And in terms of the whole ecosystem around what goes into it, what's required to manage it, what's required to process it. And so the notion of moving to a more digital environment is something that we're very active in. And I think one of the places and one of the reasons why we focus so much on bringing people into a formal regulated economy so that they can operate within the opportunities, but also the confines of an economy in which we're all participating in climate action, and we're not operating outside of a structure. That's one of the things that we found, at least in terms of what we've learned around our work, is that the more people who aren't involved in a formally regulated financial system, the harder it is to get them involved in any kind of activity.
And to be frank, with Kyndryl, we spun off in November, so we are still developing our policy. So I'm not going to sit here and say this is it, but I do. One of the things I'm absolutely sure of is that we are working at the country level and definitely at the state and city level, where we are able to, what I would say, have greater impact. And as I've been working with the business, I do believe that that's a better way to actually drive impact faster than at the what I call country and federal level.
If I might add just one thing, I think one of the things that have been really interesting is I've worked with a lot of small businesses. I just came back from India, where I'm seeing the impact of negative climate behavior on the most vulnerable populations. And I think that, that's the other thing to really keep in mind is, like, who are we talking about here? The hardest hit are always the hardest hit. And so this is about, women farming in India. This is about small crop farmers in Africa. These impact our food and our supply chain. So I think, keeping that at the forefront of, kind of why we're doing this and what's happening here and what's happening in real time, I think is really important. But what I would sort of say, another thing to think about is the standardization. And we talked about this a little bit, but even for companies like Mastercard, there's such a scrambled, Scrabble board of regulations and numbers and acronyms and things like that. It's really hard to keep up with everything. And I'd sort of like to just, throw a flag up and point people to a partnership that we actually do have with Salesforce around their tool that's actually helping us, but I would imagine can help a lot of people manage the data in such a way that with all of these things coming at companies saying, report here, report this way, report that way, stand on one foot and report this way. I think Salesforce has sort of developed a tool, at least, that allows us to submit all of our scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 data into one place so that we can at least manage it. And so to the extent that those types of tools allow us to focus on other things related to climate action and financial inclusion, and actually working on the things where we can make a difference, I think that's a really important piece too, is please help, let's create technology that helps everybody save time and focus on the policy advocacy or the things that are really going to allow us to make a difference in the space.
So I gotta know, what's the tool called for folks that might be interested?
Suzanne?
Sure, yeah, it's called Net Zero Cloud. And within it, we actually built it because we needed it. And we realized how much time it saved us, to Shamina's point about, focus on other things. But what we're doing and what I'd love feedback on, we have a lot of customers that are taking up this tool, is we're putting in, for example, policy advocacy ideas within the application, education tools. We're going to we're launching a carbon marketplace for high quality credits. We have a supplier engagement module, to this point earlier about how tricky it can be to get the right numbers for your suppliers. So we're just taking what we've learned and what we're hearing back from our customers, and as much as we can, kind of putting it in the product so that we have some place to both collaborate and learn, as well as, set super aggressive targets and enable your company to meet them.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think what that's a great example of is, and we haven't touched on yet, is this idea of business model transformation. That at some point, the core business models of companies are going to need to shift toward climate solutions or accelerating climate solutions. And I think Net Zero Cloud is a great example of that. And the more that companies can actually see, in this all-out mobilization that we need, we're going to need companies to look at how they're using their core business to be good for the world and move away from the things that they may have been doing in the past that were not. So I think Net Zero Cloud's a great example of that.
And to use our innovation muscle, by the way, I think that's something that we haven't talked about. I think that's one of the, we opened a lab, right? And so every company, when they're trying to figure out their innovation or what they do next, they focus on a lab. And so we started a sustainability lab in the Nordics so that we can start to put our brain power and our innovation muscle to work to also think about this. And so I think that's the other piece that I would also encourage, listeners to think about is, or, people in the audience to think about is like, how are you tying these, climate to your innovation muscle, and what can we do there to just get smarter and more creative about it?
Well, I think we're coming up here in the hour, and so I actually want to end on a last question here, and I think that those answers actually segue well to it. Which is, I'm really curious for each of you, looking ahead at, let's say, the rest of this decade into 2030, what is the sustainability challenge that you are most excited to tackle over the course of the next 8 or so years? I can call on someone if you want to.
I'm still thinking.
I'll jump in, which is two things. One, really getting behind the youth movement. I think that young people have a right to be angry, have a right to be scared, have a really important role to play as we think about the transition to a low carbon economy. So I'm really excited to see how we can learn more from you, not just invite them to speak on panels, but actually ask their opinions when you're making decisions. And so that is one thing that we're really focused on, kind of goes to our ecopreneur revolution commitment. But the second thing is around sort of divisiveness, and justice. This is just not the time to point fingers. This is the time to come together. I think we all there is so much imperfection with how we all operate, and we've spent way too long pointing fingers, blaming others. This is a point to do what's all in our power, from an individual, from a corporate, from a policy perspective, to move the needle. So I just don't have a lot of patience for just creating more. The world is too divisive right now. This is a time to look for places on where we may not agree on everything, but where can we agree? What can we come together to do? So, I think about that. We also think about justice as it relates to, we know the climate challenge disproportionately affects communities that are underserved. Making sure those people are at the table. All people are at the table, not those people, but this includes youth. This includes impacted folks around the globe. So I don't know. If I think about, the next 8 years, yes, net zero now, yes, 1 trillion trees, yes, ecopreneurs, but in a context, in a container of inclusiveness, and in a container of collaboration. I think it's going to just get us so much further than where we've been.
Yeah, I will just jump in and just sort of say, I think that just building on that, I think the notion of integration is it's the challenge, but it's actually the thing that's going to ensure that we have a holistic response to people and the planet. So the connection, the integration between economic growth and environmental action, I think over the next 5 to 8 years is going to be, at least one of the things that hopefully unite and create much more collective action and much more of an ability for companies, for people, for everybody to sort of use what they have to advance the conversation.
And I would just say that sustainability is a way of life, that it's part of how it's part of our jobs, every person's job. It's not a separate department. It's part of how we, live in terms of every day. It's incorporated in how we transport, work, eat, that it's become more embedded into how we live every day. That to me would be like, okay, we're getting there. So I would like to see it be a way of life.
I totally agree with that. And just following on the thread of what all three of you said, I think employee organizing, employee activism, employees bringing their own job function into this work is a trend that I'm really excited to see is happening now. It's going to continue to happen. And I think the more that companies, especially in the tech sector, can kind of welcome employees, helping push faster and holding their companies accountable. I think that's going to be good for everyone and good for the world.
Okay, well, that's a good note to end on. So it sounds like we need to have a holistic approach, one that brings in employees, one that centers sustainability, and thinking about, one that also centers justice, which I think is important, not just for companies to figure out how they're addressing their climate goals, but also for all of us to think about. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. I want to thank everyone who's watched along on the live stream for joining us for Protocol Climate's first event, the first of many. And thanks again to everyone for being here. And we'll continue this conversation and keep it going. So thanks, and have a good afternoon or day, wherever you are.